Hi, my name is Gibson, and I'm the co-owner and creator of the Personal Development School. This is your daily breakthrough video, and in this video, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about whether or not dismissive avoidants will often stay friends with their ex after a breakup. So we will dive into some of the reasons that they may or may not, so stay tuned for that. And we'll also talk about some really important points to become aware of if you're on the receiving end of thinking about navigating a friendship with a dismissive avoidant after a relationship has ended. So before I dive into this, we are doing our Black Friday sale for lifetime memberships after so many requests. We are reopening this. So stay tuned for that on Black Friday. We will be launching that and hosting that for 1 week. And we'll have a page up and ready to go for that to check out. So stay tuned for that. And basically lifetime memberships give you access to all 35 plus courses. We add 2 new ones every month. I do 4 live webinar calls a week. We have over 200 webinars in the webinar library, and we do 4 social events per week. So a guided morning and evening routine with the attachment coaches. And we do a group social every single week, and we do an extra sort of deep sharing session between people and things like that. So stay tuned for that. Check all those things out. Very exciting stuff. And I'll put a link in the description box below. We also still have our With You promotion, and that is for 25% off. And we're just going to host that until things feel like they're normal again in the world, I think. So let's talk about this. Dismissive avoidance. Do they like to stay friends with individuals after a breakup? I would say as a general rule, out of all attachment styles, you would see that dismissive avoidants are least likely to, especially if it's been a longer relationship. They don't like to feel like a lot of their emotions are stirred up. And so if it's been a longer relationship and there's been a lot of connection in there and a lot of closeness, then it's often very painful and difficult for a dismissive avoidant to stay friends. And they prefer often to just really set a hard boundary and sort of have that distance and space apart from their loved one. And another thing that you'll see is, they often don't like awkwardness or emotional investment without security. And, when there's confusion here between a romantic partner versus a friend, that confusion makes, or that sort of blurred line, often makes them feel really insecure and unsafe in that relationship dynamic. And they often feel like, I don't want to feel too much around this person. And so it makes me feel safe, if I was the dismissive avoidant, for example, to keep that person at a greater distance, keep my walls up so I can fully self-soothe and fully move on. And this brings us to another point. Dismissive avoidance need to self-soothe. They've relied their whole lives, because they were often emotionally neglected in childhood, on not soothing through others, on not trying to get connection through others as a means of getting their needs met. And how they felt that they could stay safe and comfortable and sort of in control emotionally was to really break off and focus in on oneself. And so this is going to be a natural coping mechanism that's highly likely to emerge after a relationship. And when that gets infringed upon, often a dismissive avoidant will really try to push back on that to keep those parameters up or boundaries up, and to keep that safety and emotional regulation component, in their own hands, if that makes sense. Now, another thing we'll often see is they can profoundly shut down. A lot of dismissive avoidants will feel when somebody wrongs them or somebody hurts them, or there's some kind of abandonment, again, to a certain degree, because emotional neglect in childhood is a very big form of abandonment. But basically, for dismissive avoidance, they have an abandonment wound, but it's not subconscious, it's unconscious. It's so deeply pushed down that it's not something that they're consciously aware of, and they have all these behaviors and coping mechanisms basically to avoid reliving that wound again. And so when this really hurts, sometimes breakups can be really painful for dismissive avoidance, because sometimes it, in a way, gets them in touch with that old wound that they've spent so much time trying to not feel. So that can be another reason that they're like, whoa, I don't want to feel this. And they associate this person as being the source of why they feel this way, even though that deeper source often comes in relationship to themselves, and the self-abandonment that's there. Because it's funny, it's a very interesting dynamic, but dismissive avoidants are still self-abandoners to a certain degree, but in a very different form. They're self-abandoners not of their own time and their own boundaries and their ways that they self-soothe, but in their ability to be emotionally available and present with themselves and emotionally fully feel everything. And so their self-soothing is more like having good ways of escaping into things, into a movie, into television, into video games, into food, into anything that's a distraction, social media, things that will push away and kind of repress some of those feelings further. And even though they'll be really good with their boundaries to have time to do that because that's their way of self-regulating, there's still an inherent component of abandonment more deeply locked within that, which sort of mirrors like how deeply repressed that abandonment wound is and how there's all these sort of coping mechanisms built on top to avoid that. So you'll see that that will be a natural sort of pattern that gets brought into relationships, especially breakups. Now, another big thing that we'll see is submissive avoidants like to simplify things a lot of time. They like to have like structure and simplification. They don't like things to be too messy or emotionally complicated. They don't really like conflict. And so sometimes they'll go, I can't be friends with my ex because it could blur lines in future relationships. And that can be another big intellectual intention that DAs have for keeping that space and distance, though it's often combined with other points that we've just talked about so far. But in rare cases, if a dismissive avoidant is trying to be a friend after a breakup, it can be because there was a long-standing friendship first, and then the relationship wasn't that serious or didn't last that long. And then maybe that's okay for them because it feels safe enough. And they're pretty good at establishing lines and boundaries. Like if they feel like it's becoming romantic and that's not what they want, they'll put a wall up pretty quickly and reestablish that distance. But again, they often really, when there's a large breakup or the relationship is really meaningful and it wasn't just a friendship that kind of turned romantic to a certain degree, it was actually like rooted in a romantic relationship the entire time, there will more often than not be quite a bit of time that the dismissive avoidant needs to self-soothe before returning to the idea of interacting at all. And then in interesting cases, sometimes they will interact more so for a little bit of connection in a way without actually wanting to establish a friendship or a romantic relationship again. But that will be usually after quite a period of time where they've sort of regulated and feel like they're a little more comfortable again in themselves and looking back on that dynamic. So I hope this makes sense. I hope that, I guess I'll say one other thing, actually. I will say, if you are on the receiving end of potentially entering into a friendship after a breakup, you want to have a conversation about boundaries or be clear on yours, and also try to understand what this person's are or ask questions about them, because sometimes accidentally a dismissive avoidant can kind of give false hope because they will kind of reconnect to say hello or to be polite or things like this. And maybe the other person's wanting a friendship, wanting to reconnect more deeply, or even wanting maybe to hopefully reconcile. But with dismissive avoidance, always it's their feelings minus their fears. And so, if there's pain there, if there's wounds there from the relationship ending, things like that, you're going to see that there's a pretty big arm's length situation there. So if you're on the receiving end, you really want to make sure you manage your expectations regarding what you're hoping will take place, because everybody has their individual ways of healing. And when you reach out to somebody, you might have a certain set of intentions. When a dismissive avoidant reaches out or responds to something, they might be operating with a fully different set of programs. So it's just important to be aware of that. So I hope that all makes sense. Thank you so much for watching and for being here. Please like, share, and subscribe if you're getting a lot of value out of this channel, and I will see you in the next video.